At the dawn of the 19th century, Britain's pound sterling was more than money. It was empire itself. Every trade route from Bombay to Boston echoed with its authority. Sterling was trust-made metal, the invisible glue of a world painted red on maps. Yet the currency that conquered oceans would one day drown in its own pride. If you believe history explains the present, subscribe, because money always tells the truth first. Britain's rise was not magic, it was mathematics. The pound was tied to gold, not promises. Every note issued by the Bank of England carried the weight of empire and the confidence of convertibility. When a London banker wrote a check, a miner in South Africa or an exporter in Calcutta trusted it instantly. Gold was global, but sterling made it liquid. By mid-century, the British pound had become the backbone of world trade. Sterling was the standard and the empire its enforcement mechanism. Steamships, telegraphs, and banks turned London into the heart of global finance. Capital flowed outward, goods returned inward, and the empire's coin was its crown. But like all empires, debt was its shadow. The gold standard was not just an economic system, it was a religion. Stability was sacred, speculation was sin. Nations linked their currencies to Britain's, trusting its discipline and ships to guard the world's gold. For a century, sterling was the oxygen of capitalism, but oxygen burns brightest just before the fire consumes it. By 1900, one currency ruled the modern world. From Shanghai to Cairo, sterling bills financed trade, railways, and wars. London's banks stretched like invisible tentacles across continents. A century of faith built a pyramid of credit on a foundation of gold. And gold is heavy. The empire carried it proudly, unaware that weight can also drown. Then came 1914. Cannons replaced commerce, and the gold standard cracked under the cost of war. Britain suspended convertibility to pay for survival. The pound, once as solid as its navy, now floated on faith. Trenches consumed not only lives, but liquidity. Sterling's supremacy began its long retreat, one shell at a time. When the war ended, Britain tried to pretend nothing had changed. It returned to gold in 1925 at pre-war rates, restoring prestige, but not reality. The empire's debts were higher, its industry weaker, and America richer. The pound had become a monument to nostalgia, a relic polished to hide corrosion. The illusion collapsed in 1931. Facing unemployment, strikes, and a global depression, Britain abandoned the gold standard again. Sterling's link to gold snapped, and with it, the illusion of supremacy. But in losing gold, Britain found flexibility. The pound floated, the empire faltered, yet capitalism adapted. Out of failure, a new world began. As Britain stumbled, the United States rose. The dollar, backed by massive gold reserves, replaced sterling as the new global anchor. Wall Street eclipsed the City of London, and the empire of ships gave way to an empire of credit. The pound still existed, but only as a memory of when the world once spoke with a British accent. World War II delivered the final blow. Britain fought heroically, but borrowed heavily, from the same America that now set the rules. By 1945, victory felt like bankruptcy. The pound survived in name, but the empire it once ruled had vanished. Sterling had conquered the world, only to become its debtor. After 1945, Britain stood victorious but bankrupt. Its cities in rubble, its empire restless, and its gold gone to America. The pound, once a symbol of order, now begged for mercy. Washington extended loans. London accepted dependence. The age of empire ended not with a revolution, but with a signature beneath a debt agreement. In 1947, India's independence marked more than political loss. It was monetary exile. The pound's reach shrank with every departing colony. Sterling, once global, became regional. Britain's credit, once unquestioned, turned conditional. The sun no longer set on the empire. It simply went dark. The Bretton Woods system crowned a new monarch, the US dollar. Fixed to gold and supported by American industry, it became the world's reserve currency. Britain joined the system, but not the throne. Sterling was now a junior partner in the empire it once ruled. Pride turned into policy, and policy into decline. To finance recovery, Britain printed promises. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but it rebuilt the dollar's dominance even faster. British goods were old, American factories were new, London traded prestige for survival. The pound was still called sterling, but its purity was fading. By 1949, the illusion shattered. Britain devalued the pound by 30%, admitting to what the world already knew, that its wealth had evaporated. Newspapers called it realism. Politicians called it reform. But to millions, it felt like humiliation. The empire that had priced the planet could no longer afford itself. Still, the myth of sterling lingered. Commonwealth nations kept reserves in London, honoring a legacy more sentimental than practical. The sterling area became a polite illusion, a club of loyalty without liquidity. Britain exported influence instead of industry, nostalgia instead of numbers. Then came the 1950s, years of rationing, rebuilding, and reckoning. Britain dreamed of modernity, but paid in austerity. Every loaf of bread and ton of coal carried invisible interest from American loans. The pound survived, but only because Washington allowed it. Empire had become credit line. By the 1960s, the pound was a veteran of crises. Devaluations, wage freezes, and IMF interventions became its rhythm. British politicians called it managing decline. But decline is never managed, it is endured. Each bailout bought time, not trust. Each promise weighed heavier than gold. The 1967 devaluation was a confession. Prime Minister Harold Wilson assured the public that the pound in your pocket was unchanged, but the world laughed. Value is not what governments declare, it is what markets believe. The pound had lost both. By the 1970s, Britain was no longer banker to the world, but its borrower. Oil shocks, labor strikes, and inflation drained whatever prestige remained. The empire's currency had outlived the empire itself. Once the measure of civilization, the pound now measured decline. History's balance sheet was complete. In 1971, America severed the dollar's link to gold. The Bretton Woods system collapsed, and with it, the illusion of fixed value. For Britain, this was déjà vu. The pound, once anchored in gold, was now adrift again. The empire had taught the world convertibility, and the world had just abandoned it. When the dollar floated, so did everything else. Sterling tumbled through storms of speculation. The city of London lost its calm. Newspapers called it Black Wednesday before Black Wednesday. What had once been the planet's reference point was now the market's victim. Inflation roared like an empire's ghost. Wages chased prices, and prices chased panic. For ordinary Britons, the pound became a shrinking promise. For investors, it became a bet. The currency that once defined value had become the world's favorite short position. Then came the IMF crisis of 1976. For the first time in modern history, Britain borrowed from the very institution it helped create. It was not bankruptcy, it was surrender. The pound, the empire's last survivor, had finally knelt before the new order of global finance. Washington dictated austerity, London obeyed, factories closed, unemployment rose, and confidence collapsed. The pound's weakness became Britain's mirror, reflecting a nation struggling to remember its strength. Sterling no longer led the world, it followed it. Yet from that humiliation came rebirth. By the 1980s, deregulation turned London into a new kind of empire, one built on finance, not colonies. The pound was no longer global money, but the city regained its swagger. Britain had traded territory for trading screens. Still, history's debt was unpaid. Each generation inherited volatility as tradition. The pound rose and fell with governments, oil prices, and global moods. It was no longer a store of value, only a story of survival. Sterling had become what it once despised: unstable, uncertain, and unanchored. When Margaret Thatcher came to power, she promised to restore strength through discipline. Interest rates soared, inflation fell, and the pound rallied. But every cure has a cost. Deindustrialization hollowed Britain's heartland while the city grew rich again. The empire returned, not in land, but in leverage. By the 1990s, the pound faced its most famous humiliation. On Black Wednesday in 1992, speculator George Soros bet against Britain and won. The pound crashed out of the European exchange rate mechanism. A single trader had done what no army ever could: defeat the empire's currency. The crash forced Britain to face a new truth. Control was illusion. Markets ruled where monarchs once did. The pound would never again rule the world, but perhaps it could serve it wisely. History had turned full circle, from gold to paper, from empire to economy. If you find meaning in how money mirrors mankind, subscribe, because the next empire will fail for the same reasons. After 1992, Britain embraced a paradox. It lost control, yet gained stability. Freed from Europe's monetary chains, the pound floated and found its rhythm again. Markets, not ministers, determined its fate. The empire was gone, but the spirit of adaptation remained. Flexibility had become Britain's new empire. The dollar now ruled the oceans once patrolled by the Royal Navy. America had inherited not Britain's colonies, but its credit system. Wall Street replaced the city as the center of global trust, and just as the pound had once been too powerful to question, the dollar became too important to fail. Yet power, like currency, is never permanent. By the 2000s, Britain's financial genius returned in a new form: global finance. The City of London reinvented itself as the world's clearinghouse, a broker of trust, not a source of it. The pound was provincial, but London was planetary. The irony deepened. The same system that had destroyed the pound now made Britain rich again. Banks thrived, speculation soared, and credit flowed, like empire's old tea roots. But history has a cruel sense of humor. Every boom writes its own obituary. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis struck London as hard as New York. The pound plummeted overnight, echoing 1931 and 1992 at once. The empire's old ghost whispered, "Leverage is the new hubris." What gold was to 1914, derivatives were to 2008, illusions of infinite security. Britain nationalized its banks to save itself, just as it once taxed colonies to save its wars. The script was the same, only the actors changed. Money had evolved, but human nature had not. Every bailout was another borrowed sunrise, every recovery another illusion of control. In the aftermath, Britain discovered humility. The pound stabilized, not through dominance, but through balance. It no longer pretended to rule the world, only to coexist with it. After centuries of commanding commerce, Britain learned the quiet strength of credibility over conquest. Meanwhile, new empires rose: the euro, the yuan, the digital coin. Each claimed to be the future, just as sterling once did, but every currency begins as faith and ends as philosophy. The pound's long fall became the world's longest warning. That belief, not bullion, sustains value. Britain's story was no tragedy, it was a rehearsal. Every modern nation repeats it in new forms. Print more, promise more, borrow more. The tools change, but the temptation doesn't. Sterling's decline is not past, it is prophecy. The names will differ, but the math will rhyme. The pound's legacy endures not in power, but in principle. It taught the world that money, like empire, must serve trust, not rule it. From gold to paper, from paper to code, value remains a moral question disguised as mathematics. If this story makes you see currency as civilization's mirror, stay with us, because history always leaves receipts. Sterling's fall was not a collapse, it was a revelation. Empires die when they mistake credit for creation. Britain's wealth was real only while it built railways, ships, and ideas. When it began to finance instead of forge, its decline was inevitable. Productivity, not prestige, sustains power. Today, the world worships liquidity as Britain once worshipped gold. Central banks print promises faster than ships once crossed oceans. Inflation whispers like a familiar ghost. The faces have changed, but the temptation remains eternal. Wealth without work, growth without ground. The British pound once defined civilization's price list. Now algorithms do, yet the lesson is unchanged. When value becomes virtual, trust must become absolute. Once trust wavers, collapse follows, not from scarcity, but from disbelief. Confidence is the last gold standard. Every currency begins as a promise and ends as an apology. Spain apologized in silver. Britain apologized in debt. America perhaps will apologize in data. The medium evolves, but morality doesn't. When abundance replaces discipline, decline begins with applause. The world that Sterling built still speaks its language. Bonds, deficits, interest rates. Even decline can be an export. Britain taught its rivals how to borrow elegantly and default discreetly. It gave the world not stability, but strategy, a way to fail gracefully. By the 21st century, the pound had become a relic, valuable for its lesson, not its leverage. Britain's economy was globalized, its culture digital, its currency humble. But humility can be strength. After centuries of commanding, Britain finally learned to listen, to markets, to mistakes, to history. When the world faces debt crises today, economists quote Keynes, not kings. The empire's end gave birth to an idea that money must serve people, not prestige. Every pound ever minted now whispers that warning, engraved not in metal, but in memory. Britain's greatest export was not steel, nor ships, nor even sterling. It was experience. The knowledge of how power behaves before it breaks. Nations study Britain not to admire its empire, but to understand their own fragility. Pride is the first symptom of decline. When currencies rise, nations feel invincible. When they fall, they remember they are mortal. The pound's journey is humanity's mirror, a story of ambition, inflation, and redemption. To measure a civilization, don't weigh its gold. Watch what it does when the gold runs out. In the quiet corridors of the Bank of England, the lesson endures. Confidence is earned, not printed. Sterling's story is not about loss, it's about wisdom. The empire ended, the insight remained. If this made you see money as more than math, stay with us, because the next chapter of history is already being written. The pound's fall was not the end of Britain, it was its education. Losing power forced the nation to rediscover purpose. Trade replaced tribute, partnership replaced pride. When currency ceases to command, it can finally connect. Empire had divided the world. Economics began to unite it. Every empire leaves two legacies, ruins and rules. Spain left silver, Britain left systems. Parliamentary governance, central banking, free trade, these were the scaffolds of modern capitalism. The pound's value faded, but its institutions endured. Influence often survives where control does not. What gold was to the 1800s, trust is to the 2000s. The new reserve currency is not metal, it's belief. Every dollar, euro, and yen stands upon the same fragile foundation sterling once did, the confidence of strangers. History has no currency stronger than faith. When nations print beyond their means, they echo Britain's post-war illusions. When they promise endless growth, they replay imperial arrogance. And when they treat debt as destiny, they forget that every ledger ends with a reckoning. Sterling's story is not over. It's recurring in different names. Britain learned that humility is a better reserve than gold. True wealth lies in adaptability, in knowing when to lead and when to learn. The empire's final gift was perspective, that prosperity without prudence is a crown without a head to wear it. The pound's story proves that collapse is often creation in disguise. Britain's fall from dominance opened the world to pluralism, to a marketplace of ideas, currencies, and systems. In surrendering empire, it rediscovered relevance. The teacher had become the textbook. When future historians trace the rise and fall of currencies, they will see the same pattern: conquest, confidence, complacency, collapse, correction. The 5 stages of money are the 5 stages of power. Sterling simply lived them first and wrote them down in gold. For centuries, the pound measured the world's ambition. Now it measures its wisdom. Its decline is not shame, but scripture, a reminder that every society must choose between power and principle, and that wealth built on wonder must someday reconcile with truth. Empires forget, markets remember. The ledger of history always balances eventually. Spain's silver, Britain's sterling, America's dollar. Each chapter ends the same way, with a reckoning written in red ink. The question is not whether collapse comes, but whether we learn before it does. The pound's fall teaches one enduring truth: money is not power, it's responsibility. The empire of sterling collapsed because it mistook ownership for stewardship. Real wealth is moral, not material. It is earned, not printed, and every age must relearn that lesson. If this story gave you new perspective, subscribe, because History has the answers, and finance still speaks its language.